Afghanistan, Armenia, India, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Kurdistan, Lebanon. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nima Adla, and I'm glad to be bringing you another program from the SWANA Region Radio, the South and West Asia and Northern Africa Collective here at KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. Me and my co-host, Professor Hamoud Salehi, another collective member, Associate Dean of International Education at California State University, Dominguez Hills, are glad to be talking to Professor Abbas Vali. He is from Mahabad, Eastern Kurdistan, the Kurdish region in Iran. Professor Vali has a PhD in sociology from University of London and taught at the University of Wales, and is a retired emeritus professor of political theory at Bosphorus University. Professor Vali also was the president of Kurdistan University in Erbil for 3 years at the very beginning of the founding of that university as well. Hamoud and Professor Vali, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Always, I ask our listeners to keep supporting KPFK, keep supporting this show, other shows, or whatever your favorite programs on KPFK and Pacifica are, to keep us on the air. We are doing this. Me and Hamoud have been doing this for over 20 years, and we are glad to be bringing you these programs. These are the voices of the voiceless, from Kolkata to Casablanca, as our theme says. Now, today we'll be discussing Iran, the recent events in Iran, the nuclear talks with Professor Abbas Vali, and we hope that we can continue speaking with Professor Vali in the future to see what the outcomes of these negotiations, the nuclear talks with Iran, are going to be. Hamoud, would you like to start with the first question?
Well, of course, Nima, thank you, Professor Vali. It's a pleasure having you in the program. Let's start a little bit from Iran and looking at the impact of sanctions on the Iranian working class, on the Iranian middle class. As you know, in many parts of the world, when sanctions are imposed, they really don't affect those who are responsible for what's happening or what allegedly the sanctions were designed for. So the question is really straightforward. What's your assessment, or how do you assess how the Iranians cope or are coping with the economic crisis that they are going through?
The impact of the American sanctions combined with the UN sanctions on the Iranian society, on the fabric of Iranian society, has been absolutely immense. It has devastated the very foundation of Iranian industry. And when the industry is working at best about 35% of its capacity, so that means that there has been a serious impact on the industrial working class in Iran. And the industrial working class has been laid off, impoverished, and in a sense has joined the, if you like, the army of the paupers or pauperized people in Iran. And this is no doubt we can see the impact also on the sectors of the industry which are still functioning, and we see daily demonstrations and strikes by the Iranian workers. So they express their dissatisfaction, their opposition, their discontent for not having wages to meet the basic demands, with these basic requirements of their family. Aside from that, if you like, the most important, in a sense, immediate impact of it, aside from the working class, has been on the sanctions, has been on the salaried middle class. More or less, it is safe to say that the sanctions and combined with the very, if you like, devastating mismanagement of the economy by the government has demolished the ranks of Iranian salaried or modern middle class. And they are joining the army of the, if you like, the poor by the hordes every day. And this is the most alarming sociological change which has been happening in the last 15, 20 years. But now it is reaching its climax because the Iranian middle class is basically is disappearing, the industrial, and this is, you can imagine the impact of it on what we call the civil society in Iran. And civil society is shrinking. Also, in certain ways, it's being most radicalized. Aside from that, the sanctions have also, we must say that although it is true that sanctions, when they're imposed, they hurt sectors of society and population who are not in a way at all responsible for the imposition of sanctions. But in the case of Iran, I think the sanctions, particularly when they were intensified and more sanction in addition to the United Nations sanction, in addition to nuclear sanctions that had been imposed in the time of in the Obama administration and before, and then subsequently it was supported by European and so on. But when the Trump administration, if you like, reneged on the agreement with Iran and broke the agreement and moved out of the nuclear agreement with Iran and intensified sanctions, clearly this has had a very important impact on the power structure in Iran, on the power bloc in Iran. And primarily, it has its impact has been what may be called the logistics of political power. And in this case, the logistics of political power, which supports what they call the strategic depth of Iran. And it's the strategic depth of Iran, which is defined by the government in a sense where the power goes. In this case, it includes Iraq, it includes Yemen, it includes Syria, it includes South Lebanon, and also activities in parts of Africa and confrontation with Israel and American power in various fronts. Now, the sanctions have the beginning, to have, or not, they have begun, and in fact, for some time now, having impact on the ability of Iranian government, the Iranian regime, to back up this strategic depth and its policies by the required economic, by income that it usually got from the oil, and also it got quite a lot of money after reaching agreement with the Obama administration over the nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. Now that income has been cut, and Iranian government, which has primarily operated in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in South Lebanon via its proxy powers. And these proxy powers, although they are claimed to be ideologically committed to the Iranian message and Iranian objectives, but they need money to be supported, and this money is now in short supply. So a very short supply. So that means that the sanctions have also had considerable impact on the on those or ability on the regime, which is fundamentally responsible for this confrontational policy and this, this furthering this what is called the strategic depths in the region, confrontation with Saudi Arabia, with Gulf states, with Jordan, with controlling more or less sectors, important sectors of Lebanese society, economy, and polity. So yes, I think I would say sanctions, as I listed, has had very important impact on the social structure of Iran. Also has had impact on the, if you like, the ability of the power bloc in Iran to further its policies outside. And inside Iran, clearly the regime has, as a result of sanctions, has failed considerably in meeting the demands of the population, which was a crisis which what may be called in the regime, really in the sphere of what may be called biopower, where the regime has to meet the daily requirements of the population. Regime has failed fundamentally, and also it has this failure was compounded and reinforced by the pandemic and the regime's failure to deal with the pandemic. So I would say the situation in Iran, inside Iran, now we are in a classical situation of a systemic crisis, where the crisis of legitimacy, which very much always was part of the Iranian, if you like, political field, polity, now has moved to a further stage, and it's basically taken over the entire society.
I see.
If this situation continues like that, there is little doubt that the regime will be unable to run its affairs. At present, ever since 2 years ago, more or less in, I would say, after December, January uprisings in Iran, which was very severely and bloodily put down, the regime has fundamentally abandoned its claim to legitimacy. And it is basically operating by force and repression.
Now, this puts us in a good position for the next question, Professor Vali. Now,
yes,
we begin this year, 2022, with the resumption or continuation of the nuclear talks with the, after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and that's already in the pages of history, an attack on Iran is unlikely. Where does this leave the opposition and minorities? I mean, one would logically think that they want the talks to fail, but do you have that feel?
I think all those who are in one way or another standing in opposition to the regime would wish that these talks either fail, or kind of agreement which is reached would include not just the nuclear, if you like, issue. It will include also the question or issue of the human rights in Iran. It will also include the issue of delimiting severely the activities of the Iranian regime, or influence and activities of Iranian regime in Iraq, in Syria, in the entire Middle East, so to speak. Therefore, yes, what they fear is that, just like the time that when the agreement was reached with the Obama administration in 2015, then the Iranian assets were released. The regime revived, and this revived was not that the regime started using that money for dealing with the economic crisis or dealing with, if you like, repairing aspects of the damages done by the sanctions or so on and so forth. But most of that money was put into furthering regime's interest in the region. To that extent, the critics of the regime are correct that if this is a kind of unchecked and unreserved agreement with Iran over simply the nuclear issues, I don't think the Iranian opposition, or for that matter, the Iranian middle class and the Iranian working class who have been suffering and targeted by these sanctions in a way, they will be seriously unhappy. They do not want an agreement whereby this regime will be able to consolidate its power.
Well, thank you for that. Now, go ahead, Hamoudi. I think you have the next question.
I think maybe in the same context, Professor Vali, when you look at Iraq, a close ally of Iran, we have domestic politics in Iraq these days is changing a little bit. We have a new prime minister, and the relationship with Iran in that context has been somewhat questioned. I wonder whether the kind of cloud or the kind of influence that the Iranian regime has had on Iraq will continue under this new prime minister, and perhaps in the context of Iraq politics today.
I think, as I said, Iraq is in the forefront of what is called the Iranian strategic depth. And if the Iranian power, the power of Iranian regime is deprived of its economic, financial resources, it is hard to imagine that how it's going to be able to continue on the same scale as it did before, because largely Iran operated via its proxy powers, and those proxies are paid agents. And once the money doesn't come, is not available, their relationship with Iran will be loosened. And also, the changes which are taking place inside Iraq shows that there is a will and it is a drive. Obviously, I think Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, and also Europeans, and largely also the United States of America, are behind this policy of trying to isolate the pro-Iranian forces there by bolstering and by, if you like, helping the forces which are more centrist and can take hold of, if you like, in the Shi'i community, which is the main problem, so to speak there. Shi'i community is the majority community, and Iran has a significant influence there. And this influence has been largely established by via these proxy forces and by economic favors, financial favors, military support, and so on and so forth. And which has, in certain ways, Iranian policy, which started largely after Obama administration pulled out in 2011 and 12 from Iraq. And this policy, which was Iran basically entered the vacuum that was created, power vacuum, which was created there. And by spending a lot of money, by furthering its cause, by Quds force and so on and so forth, they created in this zone of influence there. This zone of influence had a devastating impact on the Sunni community. The Kurds there had their own patch, had their own autonomy, in certain ways had their own resources, and also in certain ways had their own particular relationships with European powers and with the United States of America. They managed a kind of maintaining a certain balance with Turkey and Iran and so on. So they were, in a sense, saved. But the Sunni community was largely marginalized, and in certain ways was crushed. And now is, I think, that we see that there are developments in Iraq. There is a certain, although not very powerful, signs of revival of Iraqi Arab nationalism, and that this Iraqi Arab nationalism clearly would be sort of very beneficial to the Sunni community. And also what is important is that the force which seems to be spearheading that is part of the Shi'i community, which was formerly an ally of Iran, but it is not now, or at least it seems that it has turned towards Saudi Arabia, using Saudi money and the Gulf money and so on. Namely, I'm talking about here Muqtada Sadr and his forces. I think these forces, if they are supported, and if the nuclear issue doesn't supply Iran by immense amount of money again to revive its influence in Iraq and its waning influence in Syria, then we will see a decline of Iranian power in Iraq and Syria. In Syria particularly, if we move there, it is particularly critical because it is not just only, if you like, the situation there, it's the decline of the strategic, objective of Iran, the strategic depths of Iran, but also the Russians are continuously checking Iranian power there. Although it is an ally there, but Russia doesn't want kind of an all-powerful Iran there.
Professor Vali, before Nima, if I may, just a clarification. Some have suggested that with Sadr winning the elections, becoming more powerful than he was, are suggested that has an impact on the Iranian relationship with Iran. But I haven't seen, and I'm just wondering if you could a little bit talk about the idea, you said the rise of Arab nationalism. Now I know the Saudis do help, the Emiratis, the Qatar, everybody helps, but the connections that we have a new wave of Arab nationalism. Do you mean the Iraqi Arab nationalists, meaning that there is this division between you could say Sistani, or those who are of Iranian background, or Shi'i, the whole religious debate, or Najaf versus, was it Qom? Is this, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of the rise of Arab nationalism, and whether you meant differently than Iraq is now shifting away from the power of the religious clergy.
Yes. I'm not here, referring to Arab nationalism as a kind of a nationalism with pan-Arab objective. I am meaning a nationalism which is confined to the geographical boundaries of Iraq. And this nationalism clearly has, the Sunni community is very much involved, but it is not that significant at the present. But sectors of Shi'i community in Iraq, and particularly in Baghdad, and also we see in other predominantly Arab cities and so on, have been, involved in voicing, and they voiced their, and it was at the time when these protests started, Qasem Soleimani was still alive, and he was said to be, if you like, masterminding the opposition to this protest by basically shooting protesters down. And this is backed up, this claim, by referring to what he said at the time, that in Iran, we know how to deal with protests like this. In Iraq, they're not dealing with that properly, which obviously, because it came after the December and January uprisings in Iran, in which reputedly up to 5,000 people were killed. Some would say 2,000, some would say 2,500, but the opposition claims around 5,000 people. And in fact, eyewitness would say that, they were indiscriminately shot down in Iran. But Soleimani was, if you like, proposing the same strategy in Iraq. And in a sense, also in the beginning, they went for that strategy, but it was not continued. So what I'm trying to say is that the Iranian policy and the Iranian presence in Iraq seems to have actually created a kind of opposition even among the sectors of the Shi'i community in that respect. Aside from the religious cities, which are very much economically, cities which, they are the home of religious shrines, so to speak, Najaf, Karbala, and so on. And these cities, which very much depend on a mercantile community, which depend on the coming of pilgrims and from Iran and other Shi'i sorts of communities, there still seem to be reservedly against doing away with the power of Iran in that area. But now that I think the force which was spearheading Iranian power and politics in Iraq, namely the Quds force and its leader, Qasem Soleimani, which has been seriously undermined in terms of its power and influence, I think the arena is more open than before for change in Iraq. But this change by no means, it's a very contingent outcome. It cannot be said which way it goes. I think very much, depends on the wider political scene of the agreement between Iran and the United States of America and Europe, of course.
Now, Professor Vali, I'm sorry, and Hamoud, we are at the end of our radio segment. I have a couple of other questions. I'd like to continue this on the Zoom meeting with you, and then we'll publish it on YouTube for our SWANA listeners. And thanks to our engineer, Jose, for helping us today. And thanks to our listeners. Please stay tuned for the music hour. And also, don't forget to tune into SWANA Region Radio next week. And thank you both.
Voices from Kolkata to Casablanca.
Voices of struggle.
Voices for change.
Bringing you news and analysis of people's struggles.
Professor Vali, thank you so much for those clear insights and for the clarifications and the analysis. We'd like to move to another subject, very well connected to what's happening in Iran, and that is the US withdrawal or lessons that we could take from US withdrawal from Afghanistan. A closer tie between the United States and Afghanistan, will that have a sort of an impact on Iran? In other words, what you label as strategic depth, will that undermine Iran's strategic depth, considering also that Iran has reached out to Afghanistan and Pakistan and China, and there are sort of the United States here is sort of can go either way. But the question specifically is that will a strengthening relationship between Afghanistan and the United States have an impact on Iran's strategic depth that you referred to?
Well, the Iran's policy in Afghanistan is a clear indication of, the priority and superiority of political pragmatism over ideology. You see, ideologically, Iran has nothing in common with Taliban. They are sort of very fundamental, hardline fundamentalist Sunni Muslims. And deep down, they have, if they don't reject Iranian Shiism, they have serious reservations about it. So similarly, Iranian interpretation of Islam stands opposed to Taliban's interpretation. But Iran, as often has been shown, as also in the case of Armenian and so on, Armenia, in case of Armenia, so that doesn't really care much about ideological issues when it, question of strategic depth and the power involved. So Iran wanted and has wanted to enter, if you like, the political and the military vacuum created in Afghanistan by the departure of the American forces. And before that, Iran started influencing the situation by giving money and support to Taliban and meeting their leaders, taking them, to Iran, and also reputed that after American invasion occupation of Afghanistan in 2001 and so on, Iran admitted quite large number of Afghans who were fleeing the situation in Afghanistan and established this link with them. But Iran's work in Afghanistan is not so easy and clear-cut and straightforward as it is in the Arab Middle East, in Iraq particularly, and Syria. There are serious competing forces in Afghanistan. Iran has to really challenge the influence of Pakistan if it wants to open up. And Pakistan are the primary supporters, major backers of Taliban, and also the larger powers there. Primarily Russia and China. I mean, China is clearly in alliance with Pakistan in Afghanistan, and Russia is in a situation trying to cut out a zone of influence and deal with the Taliban. But they all, both China and Russia, but more so Russia, are handicapped in this respect, and that is the existence of forces of what may be called, and it's called Muslim fundamentalism in their own territory, which particularly the Chechens and, stretching to Central Asia, Uzbeks and Tajiks, and also in Uyghurs and so on, they have, if you like, these governments, these states have problems with these communities, and I think they cannot really, make clear-cut alliances with Taliban in that respect. So both China and Russia would be working towards, sort of political agreements with the Taliban that would involve moderation and modification of objectives, and also non-intervention in their political situation. Iran, similarly, I think, has its own problems in relation to dealing with Afghanistan, and that is that it wouldn't want Afghans to influence the Sunni community in Iranian Baluchistan. And for that matter, even as when the Taliban power was established in Kabul, one of the first, person, so a person of influence in Iran, which openly supported them, was the chief Sunni cleric in Baluchistan. So this is the case. I think Iran knows that it is, Afghanistan is not Iraq. Afghanistan has other sort of political actors, military actors involved in there. And also it knows that I think there are serious ideological and political limits for cooperation with the Taliban government. But the objective that Iran is pursuing is to help to work out a kind of agreement which would make the return of the American and European powers to Afghanistan, I would say, if not impossible, but it's make it very difficult. I think that is because, but Iran does know, like other powers, that Taliban on their own will be unable to sustain their power there. If they don't have foreign support, particularly financial support, it would be very difficult for the Taliban to continue to rule all of Afghanistan. No. This is very clear. And I think Iran wants Taliban to have all of Afghanistan, but wants promises from Taliban in relation to the Shia community, and also wants promises from Taliban for non-intervention, interference in the Baluchistan and Sistan in Iran. These are things that Iran wants, and also try to strengthen kind of agreements would keep the Taliban in power so that there won't be any reason for the return of American and European powers into. Yeah. Well, to begin with, well, yes.
Can I ask you one more question, Professor Vali? I believe you sort of answered this a little while ago, but I just want to make sure if I understood it. Will Iran's role as a regional player suffer setbacks, and if these nuclear talks succeed, that would curb Iran's region of influence? I mean, it would take away from their, let's say, lawlessness in some ways. I believe you said that really depends on the financial aspect of the negotiation deal. If Iran gets everything it wants, is that correct?
Yes. You see, not just financial aspects of it. The problem is that we don't, I mean, people like me who are trying to make sense of the situation, trying to study the situation, we really do not know the nature of this agreement, right? What does this agreement involve? To what extent the United States of America is going to accept the demands of its allies, primarily Israel and Saudi Arabia, in making this deal. Now, if it is, if it takes into consideration their interest, then clearly this nuclear deal is not going just to be a deal on delimiting or sort of destroying Iranian military nuclear capabilities, or Iran emerging nuclear capabilities, or developing the nuclear capabilities. But it will involve a serious limitation, imposition of serious, if not, if you like, ending of Iranian influence in Syria and in Iraq. Or, these are things that but we do not know. I mean, the way that the gestures, things are going, are very, very, if you like, confusing. If you go by, let's say, by the attitude and, and the kind of the signs that Mr. Blinken and Mr. Mali are dropping, then we would say that, yes, I think America, the United States of America is going to have an agreement similar to the one that Obama had, which would involve only limitation of Iranian nuclear power in return for releasing Iranian assets and also allowing Iran to export oil. If that is the case, then clearly it will mean that Iranian power in the region is going to revive, is going to be given a new lease of life, is going to be supported logistically, which involves primarily economic and financial, which will be translated to Iran's military strength there. But if it is an agreement which involves, it's kind of multifaceted. It involves, on the one hand, the limiting of Iranian nuclear power. On the other hand, it will take into consideration Iranian strategic depth and Iranian foreign policy in the region, and also the question of human rights. We really do not know at the moment, but the way that so far Mr. Blinken and Mr. Mali have behaved is not, if you like, it doesn't seem to be very, if you like, susceptible to the kind of demands that Saudi Arabia or Gulf states or Israel is making. But this time, I think, unlike the previous, unlike Obama administration and the previous agreement, where Obama and Europeans succeeded by forming a front whereby they more or less kept Israel at bay. They reached an agreement with Iran by, kind of ignoring the pressures coming from Israel and pro-Israeli forces inside the American administration. But now the situation, I think, is slightly different. I think Biden's administration does not have that kind of, if you like, free hand as Obama's to kind of overlook the interests and demands of its Arab allies on the one hand, and Israel on the other. I think if it reaches a kind of dead end within which doesn't seem to be, I think certain agreement has been reached. Today, the Iranian money markets responded to that, and the price of dollar in Iran declined by about 10 to 15. Yes. So it means that the Iranian money markets have already responded to this situation.
That's true.
But this is, yes, and but that doesn't mean that they actually know what is going on, because a lot of these, money speculators and so on work by rumors. And if this agreement is not on the, upping, is not on the agenda, is not yet achievable, I think if it goes on like that, probably pressures from Europeans would, and also Israel and also Saudi Arabia, may result in the change in the negotiating team of America.
That was perfect, Professor Vali, because the next two questions, which are our final questions, are actually about that. My question is that if you take a look at these negotiations, even in the Obama era, the Europeans were more eager or more enthusiastic about to keep the negotiations going on, while the US was more or less lukewarm to finding a way. I mean, especially in the Trump era, obviously, but overall. So that's my question. Please go ahead. Why do we see a difference between the attitude of us, the Americans, versus European Union in general?
First of all, I think European powers do not have the same clout as America has in the Middle East, nor do they have the same responsibilities or the same, alliances. I think they are more flexible in relationship to Israel and more flexible in relationship to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, which America is not really. And this is one reason. And second is that I think Europeans deeply, deeply fear a kind of outcome which will result in the, not only just decline, but the collapse of Iranian regime. They fear that. It's not that because they love Iranian regime, but I think they fear an outcome of another Iraq or another Syria indeed. So they are pushing for an agreement, which I would say that probably they will be for the idea of not including the question of human rights in the agreement. But I don't think to what extent they can really convince the present American administration to go the way that the Obama administration went in relation to Saudi Arabia, other Arab Gulf Arab states, and in particular Israel. But I think this is, and also Iran for Europe has quite a different economic meaning than it has for the United States of America. We know that the power of oil has declined, and with it, the power of oil-producing countries. And we know that in the last 10, 15 years, the United States of America has started producing oil, and in a large scale, unlike before. So it's not that dependent really on the oil coming from outside. But Europe is not like that. Europe still is dependent in certain ways. European industry and the European economy generally is dependent on importing energy. So they want an agreement which will not be very much against the status quo in the region. It would satisfy.
Professor Vali, I know we're running out of time, but I'd like to ask you last question. And this is, we began this interview by talking about the impact of sanctions on the Iranian people. Yes. We'd like to end it with the impact that these sanctions and attempts to weaken. We've seen a lot of attacks and reports about attempts to weaken Iranians' military power in the region. Mm-hmm. And then you have, connected to that, you have the Israelis threatening and sabotaging or taking cyber attacks allegedly on the Iranian economy and institutions. Has the US been able to weaken the Iranian military capability?
I think, yes, I think it has at the moment, not very significantly, because the reason is this, that Iran, like most closed or, sort of totalitarian regimes, I mean, I'm using that loosely, that concept, let's say dictatorial regimes, has this ability of channeling whatever resource it has to military and security, channels, putting them there. So it doesn't really care about welfare of people. In a sense, what has suffered mostly from the, sanctions is the welfare of the people, the life of people, the living standards of people, the purchasing power of people, and so on. I think the Iranian government quite happily can go on with a stagflation, that is a large scale unemployment and large scale inflation, and without really budging a lot, but at the same time putting all its resources available to military and security things, because it knows that once the legitimacy of the regime has collapsed, the only thing which can sustain the regime is repression at home and, if you like, this kind of interventionist policy abroad. And this confrontation, which, in a sense encapsulated in its opposition to the United States of America ever since the revolution, has now become, in the last 40 years or so, has become a major facet of the identity of Iranian regime. And the Iranian regime would in no way want to give up its military and, if you like, security objectives, and it will continue bolstering the forces. But again, I would say that the sanctions have had impacted the military power of Iran in terms of curtailing and in terms of delimiting its powers and its ability to get the material that it wants.
Well,
both into, yes, this
Dr.
is a very important issue, that various military sanctions on military and security organizations clearly has had impact on that, but that doesn't mean that Iran is not getting support from Russia, from China, from Northern Korea, and wherever that, the money that Iran is putting to security and military efforts is going to pay.
Dr. Professor Abbas Vali, thank you very much for giving us your time, and Professor Hamoud Salhi from the SWANA Region Radio Collective. Thank you both. This was very interesting. Hopefully in the near future, we can continue and have another discussion in regards to other parts. And thank you for joining us at this late of an hour, Professor Vali.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Dr. Salehi and for a wonderful sort of discussion that we had. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much.
I say from here, I say good morning to your
It's
your audience, which probably are in there. But it's nice, sort of, I think modern technology has done wonders.
Thank you very much. And this was a great show, and Zor Spas.
Thank you.
Take care. I'll email you.